So if you're anything like me, first the obligatory, God help you, and second, around this time of year, you're always looking for another classic horror movie to pop in and spend an evening enjoying. And with decades worth of options to choose from, you might find yourself overwhelmed with how much is out there. But as I always say, if you're having trouble making a decision, double it and give it to the next guy. In this case scenario, having 2 monsters in your picture for the price of 1. Yeah, for nearly as long as we've had monsters on the silver screen, there have been creatives behind the camera wondering, why don't we mix our chocolate and peanut butter and put together a creature feature with all the scares we can legally pack in? What could go wrong? Because after all, what's better than 1 scary monster in your movie? Why not 2, or even 3? Unfortunately, unlike jello shots at your uncle's second wedding, it is possible to overindulge and ruin the whole event. But how long have they been taking a crack at this idea on the big screen? Why isn't it something we see more franchises attempt? And how come it's always the more the merrier, except when it comes to the monsters and the scares they provide? So put on your scary face and team up with the nearest creature from the public domain, and let's discuss. So monsters have been crossing over between each other's franchises since the early 1940s. The first one of note being Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943, which if you can believe it is actually kind of a sequel to the original 1941 The Wolfman. A story about Larry Talbot, played by Lon Chaney Jr., who, when returning to his family's homeland of Wales, in order to bury his brother who's recently passed, ends up getting bitten by a mysterious wolf and is now cursed to transform into a horrifying beast under the full moon. And cutting right to the chase, the story ends with Larry dying and presumably being buried alongside his brother. And this is pretty much where the crossover Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman picks up. Seeing Larry return from the dead, realizing that the curse that afflicts him also seems to have rendered him immortal, and now seeks to find someone in this world who can help bring an end to his torment and allow him to be finally put to rest. This is what allows us to set up his encounter with one Victor Frankenstein, or at least it would be if the man wasn't, past tense, but maybe something in that old castle he's left behind might point Larry in the right direction. Say for example a 7-foot-tall reanimated corpse with bolts on his neck. And that's really the first of these crossovers. And as a film overall, I think it does a pretty good job being a sequel to The Wolfman, though my biggest problem with it is that I find that Frankenstein's really just tacked on. Like, the story doesn't really do much to progress the character of Frankenstein's monster, or dive into the man who created him. But everyone acts their part well, especially Lon Chaney, continuing to shine as Larry Talbot and the Wolfman. Though it would unfortunately be the best of these crossovers, at least with this group of monsters, considering that its follow-ups, House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, would leave a lot to be desired. Though the comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which brought back all these characters, was a lot of fun in its own right, and was in line with the normal hijinks and adventures that the comedic duo would get up to. But this is also where a lot of these horror movie crossovers problems would emerge. In fact, I've distilled it down to 3 key issues that the vast majority of these monster mashups suffer from. And this includes both the ones from the golden age of cinema, as well as the more modern contemporaries. The first major issue is the fact that a lot of the time, because these are following 2 franchises coming together, the story needs to divide up evenly tales that had their own entire feature dedicated to them. And now with the 2 of them forced to share the spotlight, it's very common that one will come out more favorable than the other. In Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman's case, was kinda pretty much just a sequel to the Wolfman, seeing Frankenstein's monster not even appear until the halfway point, at which time he's barely in the thing, only being utilized in a handful of scenes, and in the final confrontation. But he's not given any development, and this is double the case in the sequel, where he's competing for time against both the Wolfman and now Dracula, who they thought would be fun to throw into this get-together. And beyond this little group of characters, this issue is prevalent amongst many other horror crossovers, such as the case with films like Freddy vs. Jason, which are pretty much just a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel, where Jason also happens to be stomping about, or in the cult classic Alien vs. Predator, which to me always felt more like an Alien movie, with the entire first third dedicated to the humans, only for after that significant chunk of the runtime, the Predators finally show up, where they only have like 2 full fight scenes with the aliens and then 1 final battle with the Queen. And they don't even get the final kill. That instead goes to the human protagonists, with all the Predators themselves dying before the credits. Hell, even with pseudo-horror movie crossovers like with Godzilla vs. Kong, though Japan's favorite giant lizard got top billing, in the end, Kong got the whole movie, leaving the King of Monsters himself as more or less an afterthought. And yeah, I know Toho has been putting these movies together for decades, long before even the implementation of CGI and these big blockbuster special effects. But we're mostly talking about stuff going on in the MonsterVerse, because the Toho side of things is an entire discussion all on its own, with kaiju on kaiju violence dating all the way back to the 1960s. But it's really heartbreaking to see Godzilla in the modern Monster Universe movies is little more than a side character, and what are pretty much just Kong adventures, showing up for a few fight scenes and then going off on his merry way. Though I do love that he treats the Roman Colosseum like a big cat bed. So yeah, there's a big problem with the film feeling like it's dedicated to one character, and with the other is just a guest star. The next big issue that these things run into is the fact that, well, they're not all that scary now, are they? Yeah, though many of their leads got their start in horror cinema, these stories pitting them up against each other are less spooky tales packed with thrills and chills, and more akin to like a WWE mashup. Because a lot of the time, these films are less interested in weaving a narrative all on their own, and more so in justifying why these two worlds are colliding. Such is the case with the AVP movies, neither of which had all that compelling of a cast, or deeper themes they were looking to explore. Nah, they knew that what was getting people's butts in the seats wasn't to get the answers to questions like the legacy of man, or what it means to be alive. Nah, you wanted to see a predator cut an alien's head in half. And on that, the films mostly deliver. Same with Freddy vs. Jason. No one really cares why we're back at Camp Crystal Lake. You just know that this is the battleground to see these two titans come to blows and figure out which one would come out on top. It just sucks that until these scenes are underway, the films leading up to that are more often than not just an absolute slog to get through. So while you can say a lot of things about these movies, you really can't claim that they're all that frightening. Sure, they'll pack in as much gore and gruesome violence as they can allow, when they're not hampered by a PG-13 rating. Or they could at least, bother to turn on a light. I mean, Jesus, I'm getting real sick and tired of having to boost the exposure and contrast just to show clips from this poorly lit nightmare. You have to understand that there is a difference between mood lighting and underexposed, and this is it right here. But whether it's upping the violence or cutting the power, never managed to capture that sense of dread and fear factor that the originals managed to elicit. Which is often a byproduct of the pacing. These monster mashup films, especially the ones with verses in the title, are much quicker paced because they have so much more they need to jam in. Essentially trying to combine two horror movies into one roughly 90-minute runtime. And lastly, we got our third difficulty these movies contend with, which is that more often than not, they're kind of just schlocky B movies, which have their place in the world of cinema, but it's usually something that the studios aren't going to dedicate that much time and resources into. And sadly, despite all the hard work and talent that goes into some of these, it's not often that it kickstarts many of their careers into stardom. And it's partially why you can see the production of these things waning. Aside from those asylum films like Ape vs. Mecha Ape, or Bigfoot vs. Megalodon, which are both bad and I don't recommend watching them. Also, they might have a few dog whistles. So yeah, even more reason to steer clear. But the end result is that these movies are often not the springboard for a creative's career that one might initially hope they could be. Also, with the growing difficulty of acquiring these characters' rights, it's becoming harder to retain these things normally low budget. Which leads us quite nicely into a feature of a lot of modern movies, the fact that crossovers aren't that novel anymore. Yeah, back in the early days of cinema, or even the mid-2000s, it was neat seeing franchises that you assume took place in their own little worlds, set up scenarios in which your favorite characters get to share the screen, and since it was something that so rarely ever occurred, so much so that the best you really got for the longest time were little Easter eggs indicating a greater universe. Now, everyone's trying to cash in on this craze. With the success of the Marvel movies, those things I'm normally talking quite a bit about, shared universes have kind of been the main way to play, at least when it came to having a bunch of big names in your catalog. There was a novelty in getting to see these characters come to blows and figure out which one would come out on top in a fist-to-fist brawl. And hey, if you don't believe me that this was all the rage, just look back at all those times they had Goku fighting Superman on YouTube. Yeah, nerds and cinephiles like yours truly will eat up any chance to see their favorite action figures throw down in a no-holds-bar to see which one truly has the stronger power level. But when that's the only goal of your film, then everything else around it is kind of just an afterthought, which often is not going to make up the sum of its parts. That's why a lot of these movies have these cool scenes that get clipped on TikTok or Instagram, and maybe you'll watch a YouTube video of the fight scenes, but you're not going to be willing to sit through 90 minutes of these actors dryly reading off the most generic dialogue you've ever heard in your life. So if the only draw of these things is seeing two characters whose names you recognize suit up and kick each other's ass, that's all well and good, but it's not exactly world building now, is it? And despite a lot of these movie franchises trying to follow in Marvel's success, building their own extended universes, a little detail they might have forgotten is that if you're not really all that interested in returning to the worlds other than just for these few characters, then your franchise is kind of running on fumes now, isn't it? Like, once they meet up, are they building to anything greater? Is there some kind of a story requiring these various monsters be on screen together? Or is this all just a cynical attempt to cash in on as many franchises as possible, with the hope that one series' success will help carry the other stragglers? It's for reasons like this the Dark Universe, which was pretty much just Universal trying to do what they did back in the 40s with all the same characters, just rebooted, which never got beyond a handful of projects, none of which ever crossed over. And that's really just because there was no story to tell. They didn't have a plan other than, oh, these are big names and Marvel's doing well, let's just put our big names together and we'll cash right in. And hell, most of these characters are already in the public domain anyway, so we can skirt around all that legal finagling we normally have to do to get things like G.I. Joe and Transformers in one room. And the worst part is, every movie that Universal brought us in this dark universe just kind of felt like setup for something that audience enthusiasm was never there for to begin with. If you don't have any greater ambitions than to maximize shareholder value, then I'm sorry, but no one's gonna want to show up to these things, because the novelty of crossovers is just not there anymore. And this is even more difficult when you're talking about characters whose movie rights come with some heavy price tags attached to them, meaning that they can't even be as cheap to make as they once were. With most of these horror crossovers being comparatively inexpensive to produce, never really going beyond that 80 million threshold, they're able to recoup at least the majority of their production costs, and sometimes double or even triple their budget. And this is a feature of a lot of horror movies. Even things like that Alien Romulus movie that released not too long ago. It only cost about 80 million to produce, meaning the fact that it grossed 350 million worldwide definitely guarantees that we're gonna be sticking around a bit longer in this universe where in space no one can hear you scream, which also might just be our universe. But often the budgets for these things go up after the initial release, meaning that subsequent films are probably not gonna be this cheap to produce, especially if you're throwing in two monsters for the price of one. And even though something like Disney owns both the rights to Alien and Predator, it's unlikely they're gonna risk damaging whatever goodwill they've managed to cultivate for these two brands by throwing together some cheesy slasher with the two of them together. So I imagine unless it's a really good idea that comes across some producer's desk, that's just gonna remain relegated to the comics, which comparatively cost a nickel and a dime to make. But to wrap things up, it does seem like we're kind of past the era of big movie crossovers, seeing two icons of horror either teaming up or beating the snot out of each other, without much care for the events that led up to the aforementioned showdown. And I've always felt that these movies are fun little relics of a time long since past. The era when studios were just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, often committing to screen whatever goofy ideas someone blurted out in a pitch meeting, yielded some interesting results, maybe not always being the runaway successes one might hope, but memorable in their own right. And honestly, though sometimes watching these things was a bit of a snore, I can't deny that when things really do start ramping up, they can be a lot of dumb fun. And it's really kind of refreshing seeing a movie so committed to realizing a singular idea that even though it doesn't quite stick the landing in many other regards, at least they're usually willing to just cut loose and have some fun. While I'm not too optimistic to see many more of these horror movie crossovers, I will say I'm happy for the ones we do have, and maybe one day we'll see them come back with a brand new idea that's just crazy enough to work. I mean, hell, I've been waiting 15 years for them to get started on that Inception Nightmare on Elm Street crossover I've been begging for. Come on, Warner Brothers, tag me in, I've got some ideas. Hey, thanks for watching, and if you stuck all the way to the end, why don't you check out another one of our videos on screen now. And if you want to chat directly, come join our Discord, link in the description below.